The crack of gunfire split the dawn air as Ruby Grayson ducked behind the weathered barn, her heart pounding against her ribs like a frightened bird seeking escape. Arizona Territory, 1885, a time when the desert held secrets as deadly as the men who sought them, and Ruby had the deadliest secret of all. "We know you've got it, Miss Grayson." The voice belonged to Milton Burke, owner of the largest cattle operation in Ash Fork and a man who'd kill for what she was hiding. "Tell us where you've stashed those papers, and maybe we'll let you walk away from this." Ruby pressed her back against the splintered wood, feeling every jagged edge through her worn calico dress. The documents hidden beneath the floorboards of her cabin proved Burke had stolen land from dozens of settlers by forging deeds evidence that would ruin him and free half the county from his stranglehold. "I told you, I don't know what you're talking about," she shouted back, wincing as another bullet splintered the wood inches from her head. The April morning was already warm, promising another scorching day in the Arizona Territory. 3 men advanced on her position, spreading out to cut off any escape route. Ruby hadn't planned on dying at 22, but as the daughter of a newspaper editor who'd been murdered for printing the truth, she understood the price of justice. "Search the barn," Burke commanded, "and find that schoolteacher. I want those papers." Ruby closed her eyes. She'd been the schoolteacher in Ash Fork for less than a year, sent west from Boston after her father's death left her penniless. She discovered Burke's crimes by accident, finding old land deeds among her father's belongings that contradicted the current records. Now she would pay the price for that discovery. Rough hands grabbed her shoulders, dragging her from behind the barn. She struggled, kicking and clawing, but the man holding her, Burke's foreman, Silas Tanner, simply tightened his grip until she cried out in pain. "Got her, boss," Tanner called, pushing Ruby forward until she stumbled to her knees before Burke. Milton Burke cut an imposing figure against the rising sun. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick mustache streaked with gray and cold eyes that had witnessed too much violence to retain any humanity. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, making a show of his power. "Miss Grayson." His voice was oddly gentle as he crouched before her. "This doesn't need to be difficult. Just tell me where you've hidden those papers." Ruby spat at his feet. "I'd rather die." Burke smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "That can be arranged, but not before you tell me what I need to know." He nodded to Tanner. "Take her to the abandoned mine. We'll have our chat there away from prying eyes." Panic bloomed in Ruby's chest as Tanner hauled her toward a waiting horse. The abandoned gold mine north of town was where Burke was rumored to dispose of those who crossed him. No one who went there unwillingly ever returned. "You won't get away with this," Ruby said, struggling against Tanner's iron grip. "People will ask questions." Burke laughed. "Will they? The spinster schoolteacher who kept to herself. I'll tell them you received an urgent letter calling you back east. They'll forget you were ever here by next month." Ruby knew he was right. She'd made few friends in Ash Fork, too busy with her teaching and her secret investigation to form close bonds. Only old Mrs. Holloway at the boarding house might wonder, and what could one elderly widow do against men like Burke? They rode for nearly an hour, the desert landscape growing more rugged with each passing mile. Ruby's hands were bound before her, the rope cutting into her wrists as she gripped the saddle horn. Her mind raced through possible escapes, but each scenario ended with her broken body abandoned in the unforgiving terrain. The mine entrance appeared like a dark scar in the hillside, the remnants of an abandoned camp scattered around it. Tanner dismounted and pulled Ruby roughly from the saddle. Her legs buckled beneath her, numb from the ride, and she collapsed onto the hard, packed earth. "Get her inside," Burke ordered, dismounting with practiced ease. The interior of the mine was cool compared to the growing heat outside, the darkness absolute beyond the first few yards. Tanner lit a lantern, illuminating rough-hewn walls supported by timbers that groaned under the weight of the mountain above. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a steady rhythm like a mocking heartbeat. Burke positioned himself before Ruby, blocking the dim light from the entrance. "Now, Miss Grayson, we're going to have that talk. Where are those papers?" Ruby lifted her chin. "I don't know what papers you're talking about." The back of Burke's hand connected with her cheek, snapping her head to the side. Stars exploded behind her eyes, and the metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. "Don't play games with me," Burke growled. "I know you have documents proving I falsified land deeds. I want them." "How could I possibly have such things?" Ruby asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm just a schoolteacher." Burke grabbed her by the throat, his fingers digging into her soft flesh. "You're Jackson Grayson's daughter. Your father was nosing around my business before he got himself killed back east. Now you show up in my territory, asking questions about property lines." "I wasn't born yesterday." Ruby couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision as Burke's grip tightened. "Boss," Tanner said, sounding uncomfortable. "Maybe ease up a bit. She can't talk if she's dead." Burke released her with a disgusted shove. Ruby collapsed forward, gasping for air, her throat burning with each breath. "You have 1 hour to decide whether those papers are worth dying for," Burke said coldly. "I'll be back, and if you haven't changed your mind, Tanner here will show you how we deal with troublemakers in the West." They left her alone in the semi-darkness, the single lantern casting grotesque shadows on the mine walls. Ruby tested her bonds, but Tanner had tied them professionally tight. No amount of twisting would loosen them. Time passed with excruciating slowness. Ruby's thoughts turned to her father, wondering if he had faced similar intimidation before his accident. Had he known Burke's reach extended all the way to Boston? Was that why he'd hidden those documents among family keepsakes instead of publishing what he knew? The sound of approaching horses broke through her thoughts. Burke was returning, earlier than promised. Ruby straightened her spine, determined to face whatever came with dignity. Voices echoed from outside, then gunshots, 3 in rapid succession. Ruby pressed herself against the mine wall, fear and confusion warring within her. Had Burke brought more men to torture her? Or was this something else entirely? Footsteps approached the mine entrance, a silhouette appearing against the daylight. Ruby tensed, preparing for the worst. The figure stepped into the mine, resolving into a tall man she'd never seen before. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes that assessed the situation with quick intelligence. Behind him, a second man appeared, then a third. "That her?" one asked. The first man nodded, moving toward Ruby with deliberate steps. He crouched before her, and she flinched away, expecting violence. Instead, gentle hands examined the rope at her wrists. "These are tight," he murmured, his voice low and rough, like stones tumbling in a creek bed. "Hold still." A knife appeared in his hand, and Ruby held her breath as he sliced through her bonds with careful precision. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Name's Xavier Vance," he replied, helping her to her feet. "These are my brothers, Luke and James. We've been tracking Burke for months." "Are you lawmen?" Ruby asked, rubbing her wrists to restore circulation. A smile flickered across Xavier's face, transforming his severe features into something unexpectedly handsome. "Not exactly. Let's just say Burke's been a thorn in more sides than yours." Outside, Ruby discovered the source of the gunshots. Burke lay face down in the dirt, unmoving. Tanner and the third man were seated on the ground, hands bound behind them, under the watchful eye of a fourth stranger. "You killed him," Ruby said, her voice flat with shock. "He drew first," Xavier replied without remorse. "Would have done the same to you once he got what he wanted." Ruby couldn't argue with that assessment. "What happens now?" "Now," Xavier said, studying her with those penetrating eyes, "you tell us where those papers are hidden." Ruby's heart sank. She'd escaped one threat only to fall into the hands of another. She stepped back, bumping into the solid presence of one of Xavier's brothers. "I don't know anything about any papers," she said, the lie automatic after so many repetitions. Xavier exchanged glances with his brothers. "Burke seemed mighty convinced you did." "Burke was mistaken," Ruby insisted. "I'm just a schoolteacher." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of yet another rider, appearing from the direction of Ash Fork. Xavier and his men tensed, hands moving to weapons, but relaxed when they recognized the newcomer. "Marshal," Xavier acknowledged as the man dismounted. U.S. Marshal Daniel Harrington surveyed the scene with practiced eyes. "I see you found them, and Burke saved us the trouble of a trial." "Self-defense," Xavier said with a shrug. The marshal nodded, then turned his attention to Ruby. "Miss Grayson, I'm glad to see you alive. When you missed your meeting with me this morning, I feared the worst." Ruby blinked in confusion. "Meeting? I don't the telegram I sent yesterday," Harrington prompted. "About your father's investigation." Understanding dawned like sunrise across the desert. This was why Burke had moved against her today. He'd intercepted the marshal's telegram, realizing she was about to turn over evidence. Before Ruby could respond, Xavier stepped between them. "She doesn't know anything," he said firmly. Burke was chasing shadows. "Miss Grayson here is just a schoolteacher caught in something she doesn't understand." The marshal looked skeptical. "Is that so?" Ruby stared at Xavier, trying to decipher his intentions. Why would this stranger protect her secret? What game was he playing? "It's true," she found herself saying. "I don't know what Burke wanted from me." Xavier's eyes met hers briefly, a silent message passing between them. "Trust me." Against all reason, Ruby did. "Well, that's disappointing," Marshal Harrington said. "I was hoping to finally close the book on Burke's operation." "You've got Burke himself," Xavier pointed out, "and these two." He nodded toward Tanner and the other man. "That should be enough to satisfy the judge." The marshal sighed. "I suppose you're right." "Miss Grayson, I'll need your statement about what happened here today. Would you be willing to ride back to town with me?" Ruby glanced at Xavier, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Of course, Marshal." As preparations were made for the return journey, Xavier approached Ruby privately. "When we get back to town," he murmured, "pack whatever you need and meet me behind the livery stable at sundown. Those papers aren't safe in Ash Fork." "Why are you helping me?" Ruby asked. Xavier's expression darkened. "Burke wasn't working alone. There are powerful men behind him, men who'll send others when they learn he's dead. The papers you have are worth killing for, and they won't stop coming." A chill ran through Ruby despite the desert heat. "How do you know so much about this?" "Because I've been hunting these men for 3 years," Xavier replied. "Ever since they burned my family's ranch and killed my parents when my father refused to sell." The ride back to Ash Fork was tense, the marshal keeping Ruby close while Xavier and his brothers followed with the prisoners. Ruby's mind raced with questions. Could she trust Xavier Vance? Did she have a choice? By the time they reached town, the sun was low in the sky, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. The marshal took her statement at the small jailhouse, while curious townspeople gathered outside, whispering about Burke's death and the mysterious strangers who'd brought in his body. "You're free to go, Miss Grayson," the marshal said finally, "though I'd advise staying close. There may be more questions once I sort through this mess." Ruby nodded, already planning her escape. She hurried to her small cabin behind the schoolhouse, gathering only what she could carry in a single bag. The precious documents came last. She pried up the loose floorboard beneath her bed and removed the oilskin-wrapped packet hidden there. For a moment, she hesitated. These papers had cost her father his life. Was she willing to risk everything to see justice done? The alternative was to burn them now, pretend none of this had happened, and hope Burke's associates believed she truly knew nothing. But Ruby was her father's daughter. She tucked the papers into her bag and slipped out the back door as dusk settled over Ash Fork. Xavier was waiting behind the livery as promised, holding the reins of 4 saddled horses. His brothers were nowhere to be seen. "You came," he said, sounding faintly surprised. "Did you think I wouldn't?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I wasn't sure. Most sensible folks would run the other direction from this kind of trouble." Ruby raised her chin. "My father didn't raise me to run from what's right." "No," Xavier agreed, taking her bag and securing it to one of the horses. "I expect he didn't. Where are we going?" Ruby asked as he helped her mount. "North, to Prescott first. My brothers are creating a diversion to make anyone watching think we've headed south." Xavier swung into his own saddle with practiced ease. "We'll meet them in a few days if all goes well." They rode out of Ash Fork as true night fell, the stars emerging in a dazzling canopy above the desert. Ruby had never imagined herself fleeing town with a stranger, yet here she was, putting her trust in a man she'd known less than a day. "You still haven't told me why you intervened," Ruby said after they'd been riding for an hour in companionable silence. "How did you even know I was in trouble?" Xavier was quiet so long that Ruby thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft against the rhythm of the horses' hooves. "We've been watching Burke for weeks, waiting for the right moment to move against him. This morning, we saw his men drag you from your cabin." He paused. "I recognized the look in your eyes, the same one my mother had when she stood against the men who came for our land. I couldn't let history repeat itself." Ruby absorbed this, feeling a connection to this taciturn stranger deepen. "I'm sorry about your parents." Xavier nodded once, acknowledgement without words. "The papers prove Burke wasn't acting alone," Ruby said after another stretch of silence. "They show a pattern of land theft across 3 territories, always using the same methods, always benefiting the same company, Western Frontier Investments." Xavier's head snapped toward her. "You're sure that name appears in the documents?" "Multiple times. My father had been investigating them for months before he died." Xavier urged his horse closer to hers. "Western Frontier is owned by Senator William Harding. He's been buying up land all through the territories, using men like Burke to do his dirty work. The railroad's coming through, and any property along the proposed route will be worth a fortune." Ruby felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "A U.S. senator. That's why the law can't help us," Xavier said grimly. "Harding has judges and marshals in his pocket across the Southwest. The only way to stop him is to take those documents to the governor in Phoenix, along with witnesses willing to testify." "Witnesses like me," Ruby said, understanding dawning. "And you," Xavier nodded. "And others we've found along the way. People who have lost homes, land, loved ones to Harding schemes. They made camp that night in a small canyon hidden from the trail." Xavier built a fire small enough not to be seen from a distance, but sufficient to ward off the desert chill. He moved with the easy competence of a man accustomed to life outdoors, and Ruby found herself watching him, intrigued by the contradiction of his gentle hands and hard eyes. "How did you become involved in this?" she asked as they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. Xavier gazed into the fire. "After my parents were killed, my brothers and I tracked the men responsible, led us straight to Burke. But when we realized he was just a pawn, we decided to aim higher. He looked up, meeting her eyes across the flames. We want Harding himself. That's a dangerous ambition, Ruby observed. So is hiding evidence against powerful men, Xavier countered with a hint of a smile. Seems we're both fools for justice, Miss Grayson. Ruby, she corrected. If we're going to be fugitives together, you might as well use my given name. Ruby, he repeated, and something in the way her name sounded in his deep voice made her heart beat faster. You should get some rest. We've got a long ride tomorrow. Ruby settled into her bedroll, watching as Xavier took the first watch. In the flickering firelight, she could see the strong lines of his profile, the vigilant set of his shoulders. Despite the danger of their situation, she felt strangely safe in his presence. For 3 days, they rode north through increasingly rugged terrain. Xavier proved to be a skilled guide, finding water where Ruby saw only parched earth and choosing paths that concealed their trail from potential pursuers. At night, they took turns keeping watch, though Ruby suspected Xavier slept little even during his rest periods. Slowly, their initial wariness gave way to cautious friendship. Ruby learned that before the tragedy that claimed his parents, Xavier had been studying law in St. Louis. His brothers had been running the family ranch, with dreams of expanding it someday. All those plans had died with their parents, replaced by a single-minded pursuit of justice. In turn, Ruby told him about growing up in her father's newspaper office, learning to set type before she could properly write, and how she'd come west after his death to start a new life, only to find herself entangled in the very conspiracy that had likely killed him. Your father would be proud of you, Xavier said on the third evening as they camped in a stand of cottonwoods beside a small creek. Not many would have the courage to carry on his work. Ruby smiled sadly. I'm not sure courage had much to do with it, more like stubbornness. My mother always said I got a double portion of my father's determination and none of her common sense. Xavier chuckled, the sound surprising and warm in the quiet night. My mother said something similar about me. She was right, Ruby teased, feeling bold in the friendly darkness. A sensible man would have left Burke to the law, not gotten involved with a schoolteacher's troubles. Maybe I'm not interested in being sensible. His voice had dropped, taking on a quality that made Ruby acutely aware of how alone they were beneath the vast desert sky. She looked away, suddenly flustered. We should reach Prescott tomorrow, Xavier allowed the change of subject. By midday if we start early. My brothers will meet us there assuming all went well with their diversion. And if it didn't, then we continue alone, he said simply. The documents are what matter. Ruby studied him in the firelight. Is vengeance all that drives you, Xavier? What happens after Harding falls? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was silent for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick. I haven't thought that far ahead, he admitted finally. For 3 years this has been my only purpose. There has to be something after, Ruby said softly. Some life you want to build when this is over. Xavier looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. What about you? Will you go back to teaching after? Ruby considered this. I don't know. I loved teaching, but I also loved working at my father's newspaper. Maybe I'll start a paper of my own somewhere. You'd be good at that, Xavier said. You have a way of getting people to tell you things. Ruby laughed. Is that what I'm doing with you? His answering smile sent a flutter through her chest. More than you know. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities, until Xavier cleared his throat and stood. Dawn comes early. We should get some sleep. Prescott appeared on the horizon the next day, a growing collection of buildings nestled against pine-covered hills. After days in the desert, the sight of green trees and the promise of civilization was welcome, though Ruby felt a curious reluctance to end the journey that had brought her closer to Xavier than she'd expected. "We'll stay at the Arizona Hotel," Xavier said as they approached the town. "It's owned by a friend who doesn't ask questions. My brothers will find us there if they made it through." The Arizona Hotel proved to be a respectable establishment on Montezuma Street. Xavier registered them as Mr. and Mrs. Vance, a precaution that brought color to Ruby's cheeks but made tactical sense. A married couple would attract less attention than an unmarried man and woman traveling together. Their room was small but clean, with a single bed that immediately presented an awkward dilemma. "I'll sleep on the floor," Xavier said, reading her expression. "We just need to maintain appearances in public." Ruby nodded, grateful for his consideration. "How long do we wait for your brothers?" "2 days," Xavier replied, setting their bags beside a worn dresser. "If they don't arrive by then, we assume they've been delayed or captured, and we move on to Phoenix alone." The gravity of their situation settled over Ruby anew. "Do you think we're being followed?" Xavier's expression grew serious. "Almost certainly. Harding will have men searching every town between here and Mexico by now. That's why we need to stay inside as much as possible." Confinement to a small hotel room with Xavier Vance was both comforting and unsettling for Ruby. Comforting because she had come to trust his judgment and capability. Unsettling because the growing attraction she felt toward him was harder to ignore in close quarters. They spent the afternoon reviewing the documents, with Xavier explaining connections Ruby hadn't fully understood. His legal training made him adept at identifying the patterns of fraud across different territories, and his personal experience brought emotional weight to the dry facts on paper. "This deed here," he said, pointing to a document dated 2 years earlier. "This was the Wilkerson place, just north of our ranch. Old Jacob Wilkerson was found dead in his barn a week after refusing to sell. The sheriff called it an accident, but everyone knew better." Ruby placed her hand over his on the paper. "We'll make them pay for what they did, Xavier, all of them." He turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining. "This is bigger than revenge now. It's about stopping them before they steal more land, ruin more lives." Their eyes met, and Ruby felt the shift between them from reluctant allies to something deeper, something with roots that had taken hold during their journey together. A knock at the door shattered the moment. Xavier was on his feet instantly, gun drawn as he motioned for Ruby to move behind him. "Who is it?" he called, positioning himself beside the door. "Your favorite brother," came the reply. "Unless you found a new one since Ash Fork." Relief washed over Xavier's features. He holstered his weapon and opened the door to admit Luke and James Vance, both looking trail-worn but unharmed. "Took you long enough," Xavier said, though his smile betrayed his relief. Luke, the younger of the two by perhaps a year, grinned as he entered. "Had to take the scenic route." Burke's remaining men were mighty persistent. James, who shared Xavier's height but carried more bulk on his frame, nodded respectfully to Ruby. "Miss Grayson, glad to see you made it safely." "Ruby, please," she insisted, "and I'm glad you both did as well." The brothers had brought supplies and news neither welcome. Harding had indeed dispatched men in all directions from Ash Fork, offering substantial rewards for information leading to Ruby's capture and the recovery of the missing documents. "They're saying you stole from Burke before murdering him," Luke explained. "Got posters with your likeness all through the territory." Ruby paled. "My likeness?" James produced a wanted poster from his saddlebag. The sketch bore enough resemblance to make recognition possible, though it portrayed her as harder, more criminal in appearance than her actual self. $500, she read with disbelief. "Dead or alive?" "Harding's desperate," Xavier said grimly. which means we're on the right track. They decided to leave for Phoenix the following morning, traveling as a family group to attract less attention. The brothers would take a room down the hall for the night, giving Ruby and Xavier privacy to rest. After they departed, an awkward silence filled the small room. The single bed loomed large in Ruby's awareness. "I meant what I said," Xavier assured her, spreading his bedroll on the floor. "You take the bed." Ruby sat on the edge of the mattress, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's revelations. "I never imagined I'd be a wanted woman." "My father would be horrified." Xavier crouched before her, taking her hands in his. "Your father would understand doing what's necessary for justice. You're carrying on his work, Ruby. That takes courage." "Is it courage or foolishness?" she whispered. "People are dying because of these papers." "People were already dying," Xavier reminded her gently. "Burke, Harding, they're kind. They've been destroying lives for years. The papers just prove what they've done." He was so close that Ruby could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. Without conscious thought, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their first kiss was hesitant, questioning. Xavier's lips were surprisingly soft against hers, his hand rising to cup her cheek with tender caution. When they parted, his eyes searched hers, looking for regret or uncertainty. Ruby smiled, answering his unspoken question. This time when they kissed, there was nothing hesitant about it. Years of loneliness and months of fear seemed to dissolve in the connection between them, a promise of something neither had dared hope for in the midst of their dangerous quest. When they finally pulled apart, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I shouldn't have done that," he murmured. "You deserve better than a man with vengeance in his heart." "Maybe what you need is a woman who understands that heart," Ruby countered. "Who knows what drives you and doesn't judge it." Xavier drew back slightly, studying her face. When this is over," Ruby interrupted, "we'll decide what comes next, together." He nodded, a smile ghosting across his lips. "Together." That night, Xavier still slept on the floor, but the distance between them had diminished in ways that had nothing to do with physical space. Morning brought the challenge of transforming Ruby from a recognizable fugitive into someone who could travel unnoticed. James appeared with a bundle containing a new dress, a woman's hat with a modest veil and hair dye. "Brown," he explained. "Less noticeable than your red." Ruby raised an eyebrow at Xavier. "Your brother thinks of everything." "James was always the practical one," Xavier agreed, amusement in his voice. The transformation was effective. With her distinctive auburn hair now a subdued brown and her face partially obscured by the veiled hat, Ruby was unlikely to be recognized from the wanted poster. They departed Prescott as the Vance family, Xavier and Ruby posing as husband and wife, with Luke and James as Xavier's brothers accompanying them to their new home in Phoenix. The journey to Phoenix would take several days, through terrain that offered few places to hide. They traveled steadily, avoiding main roads where possible and passing through small settlements only when necessary for supplies. On the second day, disaster nearly struck in the tiny settlement of Bumblebee. They had stopped to rest the horses and purchase provisions when Ruby noticed a rider studying them with too much interest from across the dusty street. "Don't look now," she murmured to Xavier as they exited the general store. "But the man by the saloon has been watching us since we arrived." Xavier casually glanced in the indicated direction. "One of Burke's men," he confirmed, his voice low. "He was at the mine that day." "Does he recognize us?" "He's not sure yet," Xavier said, "but we need to leave. Now." They mounted up with deliberate calm, but as they prepared to ride out, the man approached, hand resting on his holstered gun. "You folks passing through?" he called, Xavier nodded pleasantly. On our way to Phoenix. My brother's got land there. The man's eyes narrowed as they fixed on Ruby, partially hidden behind her veil. Your wife don't say much. She's feeling poorly, Xavier replied smoothly. Morning sickness, first baby. The lie worked better than they could have hoped. The man's suspicion visibly receded at the mention of pregnancy, his eyes dropping to Ruby's midsection briefly before he stepped back. Safe travels, then, he said, tipping his hat. They rode out of Bumblebee at an unhurried pace, not daring to show haste until they were well beyond sight of the settlement. Once safely away, Luke let out a whoop of laughter. Morning sickness. Xavier, you old dog, didn't tell us you were expecting. Ruby felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Xavier merely grinned. Seemed like the kind of detail a man wouldn't question too closely. Smart thinking, James agreed, but we should push on through the night. If he has second thoughts, we don't want him catching up. They made camp only briefly, a few hours of rest before continuing under the stars. Ruby found herself riding beside Xavier, the brothers scouting ahead. Quick thinking back there, she said quietly. Though now I'm apparently with child. Xavier chuckled. Seemed less suspicious than the truth. His expression grew more serious. Does it bother you? The deception? Ruby considered this. The deception, no, it's necessary, but it makes me think. About what? About after, she admitted. If we survive this, if we bring Harding to justice, what then? Do we just go our separate ways? Xavier was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Is that what you want? He asked finally. No, Ruby said simply. It isn't. His gaze met hers, and even in the darkness she could see the intensity there. What do you want, Ruby Grayson? A chance, she replied. To see if what's growing between us could be something real, something lasting, without danger pushing us together. Xavier reached across the space between their horses, his hand finding hers. I'd like that chance too. The confession hung between them, a promise for a future neither was certain they would live to see. Phoenix appeared on the horizon 3 days later, a growing city nestled in the valley of the Salt River. Unlike the smaller settlements they'd passed through, Phoenix offered both danger and opportunity, more people to recognize them, but also more places to hide. The governor's mansion is on Washington Street, James informed them as they approached the city limits. But we can't just walk up and demand an audience. We need an intermediary, Xavier agreed. Someone the governor trusts, who will listen to our evidence without reporting us to Harding's men. I may know someone, Ruby said thoughtfully. Judge William Forrester was a friend of my father's. Last I heard, he'd been appointed to the territorial court in Phoenix. Luke looked skeptical. Can he be trusted? My father trusted him with his life, Ruby replied. And Judge Forrester was investigating land fraud cases in Nevada before his appointment here. He's no friend to men like Harding. They found lodging in a modest boarding house on the outskirts of town, with Xavier and Ruby again posing as husband and wife, while the brothers took a separate room. Their plan was simple. Ruby would write to Judge Forrester, requesting a meeting without revealing too much information in case the letter was intercepted. 3 tense days passed while they waited for a response. They ventured into town only when necessary, always watchful for signs of recognition or pursuit. On the 4th day, a messenger boy arrived at the boarding house with a sealed note. The judge will see us tomorrow, Ruby announced after reading it. At his home, not his office. He understands the need for discretion. Relief and apprehension mingled in Xavier's expression. This is it, then. After 3 years, we finally have a chance to bring Harding down. That night, unable to sleep, Ruby found Xavier sitting alone on the boarding house's small back porch, staring at the distant lights of Phoenix. Second thoughts, she asked, settling beside him on the wooden bench. He shook his head. Just thinking about my parents. Wondering if they would recognize the man I've become. Ruby took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. They would be proud of your determination to see justice done. Even knowing what it's cost me. Xavier's voice held a rare vulnerability. I've spent 3 years consumed by this. I've done things I never thought I was capable of. We all have, Ruby said softly, but tomorrow it ends, one way or another. Xavier turned to face her, his expression solemn in the moonlight. If things go wrong tomorrow, Ruby pressed her fingers to his lips. They won't. If they do, he insisted gently, I need you to know that meeting you changed everything. You reminded me there's more to life than vengeance. His words warmed Ruby from within, chasing away the chill of the desert night. When this is over, she promised, we'll both have a chance to remember what else life holds. Xavier leaned forward, his kiss a seal on that promise, tender and hopeful in ways their previous embraces hadn't been. It held the possibility of a future beyond tomorrow's confrontation, beyond the shadow of Harding's influence. Judge Forrester's home was a handsome adobe structure on the north side of Phoenix, set back from the road and surrounded by citrus trees. The judge himself was older than Ruby remembered, his hair now entirely white, but his shrewd eyes were unchanged as he welcomed them into his study. Jackson Grayson's daughter, he said, clasping Ruby's hands in his. When I heard about your father's death, I feared foul play. He was investigating some powerful interests. It was no accident, Ruby confirmed, and I've brought evidence that proves who was behind it. For 2 hours, they laid out their case for the judge, the documents proving land fraud across 3 territories. Witness statements Xavier and his brothers had collected, and Ruby's own testimony about Burke's operation in Ash Fork. Judge Forrester listened intently, asking occasional questions but mostly absorbing the mountain of evidence before him. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, expression grave. Senator Harding, he mused. I've had my suspicions about his land deals for years, but nothing concrete enough to move against him. He tapped the documents before him. This changes everything. Will the governor act on it? Xavier asked. Governor Triddle is an honest man, Forrester assured them. Once he sees this evidence, he'll have no choice but to request a federal investigation. Harding has powerful friends, but even they can't ignore fraud on this scale. Hope rose in Ruby's chest. Then it's over, the judge's expression sobered. Not quite. Harding's men are still searching for you, and they won't stop until the senator is actually indicted. You'll need to remain hidden until I can arrange federal protection. How long? James asked. A few days at most. I'll meet with the governor this evening. Forrester regarded them seriously. Stay at your boarding house. Don't venture out unnecessarily. I'll send word as soon as arrangements are made. They left Judge Forrester's home cautiously, taking a circuitous route back to their lodgings to ensure they weren't followed. The sense of imminent resolution was both exhilarating and terrifying, so close to the end of their dangerous journey, yet still vulnerable until federal protection arrived. That evening, as they shared a quiet meal in Xavier and Ruby's room, a knock at the door froze them all in place. Xavier motioned for silence, drawing his gun as he approached the door. "Who is it?" he called. "Message from Judge Forrester," came the reply. Xavier exchanged glances with his brothers before carefully opening the door. A young boy stood outside holding a sealed envelope. "Judge said it's urgent," the boy explained, handing over the message. Xavier gave him a coin and closed the door, breaking the seal with growing apprehension. His expression darkened as he read. "What is it?" Ruby asked, fear clutching at her heart. "Harding knows we're in Phoenix," Xavier said grimly. One of his men spotted us at the judge's house. Forrester says we need to leave the city immediately. He's arranged for us to meet federal marshals at a ranch 20 miles north. It could be a trap, Luke warned. Xavier shook his head. The message includes a personal reference only the judge would know. He looked at Ruby. He mentions your father's pocket watch, the one with the inscription about truth being the only worthy pursuit. Ruby relaxed slightly. That's genuine. My father showed the watch to Judge Forrester years ago. Then we leave tonight, James decided. Under cover of darkness. They gathered their belongings quickly, leaving separately to avoid attracting attention. Ruby and Xavier departed first, with the brothers to follow after ensuring they weren't being watched. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. They rode north out of Phoenix, keeping to less traveled paths as the city lights faded behind them. Ruby felt a curious mixture of fear and relief. They were so close to safety, to justice, to the future they had begun to imagine together. An hour out of the city, disaster struck. 3 riders appeared on the trail ahead, blocking their path. Even in the moonlight, Ruby recognized one of them as the man who had watched them in Bumblebee. Well, he called. If it ain't the schoolteacher and her cowboy. Thought you looked familiar despite that brown hair. Xavier pulled his horse closer to Ruby's, his voice low. When I give the signal, ride hard to the east. Don't stop for anything. I won't leave you, Ruby protested. You have to, Xavier insisted. The documents are what matter. Get them to the marshals. Before Ruby could argue further, the men advanced, weapons drawn. Xavier suddenly spurred his horse forward, firing as he charged directly at them. The unexpected assault created momentary confusion, exactly the diversion he'd intended. Now, Ruby, he shouted. Heart in her throat, Ruby urged her horse east, away from the fight. Gunshots echoed behind her, but she didn't look back, couldn't look back. Tears streamed down her face as she rode, the precious documents secure in her saddlebag and Xavier's final gift to her, a chance to complete their mission, burning in her chest like a brand. She rode until her horse began to tire, the eastern sky lightening with approaching dawn. Only then did she permit herself to stop, to listen for pursuit. The desert was silent save for the wind through the scrub brush. Ruby had no way of knowing if Xavier had survived the encounter, if his brothers had arrived in time to help, or if they too had been caught in Harding's trap. All she knew was that she needed to reach the ranch where the marshals waited, needed to ensure that Xavier's sacrifice wasn't in vain. As the sun rose fully, Ruby oriented herself by its position. She had veered further north than intended in her desperate flight, but she believed she could still reach the rendezvous point by midday. The desert heat built quickly, sweat soaking through Ruby's dress as she pushed on. Her horse was flagging, its stride shorter, its breathing labored. She allowed it to walk rather than trot, conserving its strength for the final approach. Around mid-morning, Ruby spotted dust on the horizon behind her riders approaching from the southwest. Friend or foe, she couldn't tell, but she couldn't risk waiting to find out. She urged her tired mount into a trot, then a reluctant canter, scanning the terrain ahead for any sign of the ranch. The pursuit gained ground steadily. Ruby's horse was spent, unable to maintain even a canter for long. She calculated the odds of outrunning them and found them dismal. Instead, she looked for a place to make a stand, somewhere she could hide the documents if capture became inevitable. A rocky outcropping appeared to her right, offering minimal cover but better than nothing. Ruby directed her horse toward it, dismounting when she reached the shelter of the rocks. She removed the saddlebag containing the documents and her father's revolver, sending the horse on with a slap to its flank. With luck, the animal would serve as a decoy, drawing her pursuers away. Ruby scrambled up the rocks, finding a position that gave her a view of the approaching riders while offering some protection. When they came into clearer view, her heart nearly stopped 3 men, none of them Xavier or his brothers. She checked her father's revolver, 5 bullets, enough to keep them at bay for a short time, perhaps long enough to destroy the documents if capture became inevitable. Ruby had decided she would not allow Harding's men to recover the evidence, even if it meant her own life was forfeit. The riders slowed as they approached the outcropping, clearly having spotted her horse's tracks leading toward it. Ruby steadied her breathing, remembering the shooting lessons her father had given her years ago. Wait until they're close, he had instructed. Make every shot count. The lead rider dismounted, approaching the rocks cautiously. "Miss Grayson," he called, "we know you're up there. There's nowhere left to run." Ruby remained silent, adjusting her grip on the revolver. "Be reasonable," the man continued. "The senator just wants what's his. Give us the documents and you can walk away from this." "Like my father walked away," Ruby called back, unable to contain her bitterness. "Like the Vances, like all the others Harding has murdered," the man sighed audibly. "Have it your way." He signaled to his companions, who began to spread out, preparing to approach the rocks from multiple angles. Ruby took aim at the leader, knowing she would only get one clear shot before revealing her position. Her finger tightened on the trigger. A shot rang out, but not from her weapon. The leader jerked backward, clutching his shoulder as he fell. His companions whirled toward the source of the gunfire, only to be met with more shots. "Ruby!" A familiar voice shouted. "Ruby, are you up there?" Hope surged through her. "Xavier!" He appeared on horseback, riding hard toward the outcropping, his brothers flanking him. The remaining 2 pursuers, outmatched, raised their hands in surrender. Ruby scrambled down from the rocks as Xavier dismounted, running toward him with reckless abandon. He caught her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that spoke volumes about his fear for her safety. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered against his neck. "Takes more than Harding's thugs to keep me down," Xavier replied, though she could feel a bandage beneath his shirt, evidence that he hadn't escaped unscathed. Luke and James secured the prisoners while Xavier explained what had happened. They had arrived just after Ruby fled, engaging the attackers in a firefight that left Xavier wounded, but allowed them to capture 1 man alive. From him, they learned that Harding had men watching the ranch where they were supposed to meet the marshals. It was a trap, Xavier confirmed. But not Judge Forrester's doing. Harding's men intercepted the judge's message to the marshals and set up an ambush. "Then where do we go now?" Ruby asked. "If the rendezvous is compromised," Xavier smiled, the expression warming his tired face. "The judge had a contingency plan. There's a cavalry outpost 15 miles north of here. Captain David Reynolds is expecting us with explicit orders from the territorial governor himself to provide protection until federal agents arrive from Washington." Relief washed over Ruby like a cool desert rain. "Then it truly is almost over." "Almost," Xavier agreed, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And then we can begin thinking about what comes next." They reached the cavalry outpost by late afternoon, exhausted but triumphant. Captain Reynolds, a serious man with a well-trimmed mustache, welcomed them personally, assigning them quarters within the fort's walls and placing the documents under guard. "Governor Triddle sends his personal assurances that these papers will reach the right hands," the captain informed them. "A federal prosecutor is already en route from Washington. Senator Harding's days of impunity are numbered." That night, clean and fed for the first time in days, Ruby found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. The realization that their dangerous journey was truly ending left her with a curious emptiness, as if the purpose that had driven her forward was suddenly gone, leaving uncertainty in its wake. She slipped out of her assigned quarters, finding her way to the fort's eastern wall. The desert stretched before her, bathed in moonlight, beautiful and harsh in equal measure, not unlike the journey that had brought her here. "Couldn't sleep?" Xavier's voice came from behind her. Ruby turned, smiling as he approached. "Too many thoughts." He joined her at the wall, his shoulder brushing hers. "Having second thoughts about bringing down a U.S. senator?" "No," Ruby said firmly. "He deserves everything coming to him. I'm thinking about after." Xavier's expression grew serious. "I've been thinking about that too." "And?" Ruby prompted when he didn't continue. "And I've spent 3 years defined by what I was against," Xavier said slowly. "By what I was fighting. I'm not sure I remember how to live for something instead." Ruby turned to face him fully. "Perhaps we could learn together." The hope in his eyes was almost painful to witness. "What did you have in mind?" "Judge Forrester mentioned that the newspaper in Prescott is for sale," Ruby said. "The owner is retiring, looking for someone to carry on the work." "A newspaper?" Xavier looked surprised, then thoughtful. "You did say you missed working in your father's press." Ruby nodded. "And you studied law. Between us, we could create a paper that fights for justice with words instead of guns." "Prescott," Xavier mused. "It's a good town, growing. Close enough to Phoenix to keep an eye on the territorial government. Far enough from Ash Fork to start fresh," Ruby added. Xavier smiled, reaching for her hand. "You've given this some thought." "I have," Ruby admitted, "but it's only a possibility." "I wouldn't want to assume." Xavier silenced her with a kiss, gentle but insistent. When they parted, his expression was more open than she had ever seen it. "Ruby Grayson," he said softly, "I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you stand up to Burke at that mine. If running a newspaper in Prescott means I get to be with you, then that's exactly what I want to do." "Just like that?" Ruby asked, hardly daring to believe it could be so simple after everything they'd endured. "Just like that," Xavier confirmed. "Though I suspect nothing about our life together will be simple." Ruby laughed, joy bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her. "Probably not, but it will be ours." 1 month later, Ruby stood in the newly renovated office of the Prescott Pioneer, watching as Xavier and James positioned the printing press that had just arrived from St. Louis. Luke had chosen to return to ranching, purchasing land south of Prescott with his share of the reward money offered by the territorial government for evidence against Harding. Senator William Harding had been arrested in Washington, the scandal rocking the political establishment as the extent of his land fraud scheme came to light. Judge Forrester wrote that additional indictments were expected, with several territorial officials implicated in the conspiracy. "What do you think?" Xavier asked, gesturing to the press. "Will it serve for your first edition?" Ruby ran her hand lovingly over the machine. "It's perfect. My father would have approved." Xavier wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Have you decided on the lead story? Justice prevails. Land fraud conspiracy exposed," Ruby replied, "with a special mention of the brave men who helped bring the truth to light. And the even braver schoolteacher who refused to be silenced," Xavier added, pressing a kiss to her temple. Ruby turned in his arms, reaching up to trace the lines of his face, lines that had softened somewhat in the weeks since Harding's arrest. The haunted look that had once dominated his eyes had receded, replaced by something she recognized as contentment, perhaps even happiness. "Are you happy here?" she asked softly. "Running a newspaper instead of chasing outlaws," Xavier smiled, the expression now coming more easily to him. "I'm happy with you," he said simply. The rest is just details. That night, beneath the stars that had witnessed their flight across the Arizona territory, Xavier asked Ruby to marry him. His proposal was simple, heartfelt, free of the grand gestures that might have seemed false coming from a man of his direct nature. "I know we haven't known each other long," he acknowledged as they sat on the porch of the small house they had purchased together, "but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Ruby's answer was equally simple: yes. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony attended by Xavier's brothers, Judge Forrester, and the friends they had already made in Prescott. Ruby wore her mother's wedding dress, altered by the town's dressmaker to fit her smaller frame, and carried wildflowers gathered from the hills around the town. As they exchanged vows, Ruby reflected on the strange path that had brought her here from a Boston newspaper to an Arizona schoolhouse, from a fugitive with a price on her head to the owner of the Prescott Pioneer. None of it had been planned, yet somehow all of it had led her exactly where she needed to be. The first edition of the Pioneer sold out completely, with citizens eager to read the detailed account of Harding's downfall. Xavier's legal background proved invaluable as they navigated the complex political fallout, while Ruby's gift for storytelling transformed dry facts into compelling narratives that captured the public's imagination. As autumn turned to winter, bringing cooler temperatures to the high desert town, Ruby and Xavier settled into a rhythm of work and domestic life that suited them both. The newspaper thrived, gaining a reputation for fearless reporting and unwavering principles. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire in their small home, planning the next day's edition or simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. "You ever miss it?" Ruby asked one night as Xavier stared into the flames. "The adventure, the danger." He considered this, then shook his head. "I've had enough danger to last a lifetime, though I do miss riding out into the desert sometimes." Ruby smiled. "Perhaps we could take a day, ride out to that canyon you were telling me about, make an adventure that doesn't involve being shot at." Xavier laughed, the sound still a delight to Ruby's ears. "I'd like that." In the spring, they received a letter from Marshal Harrington, informing them that the last of Harding's associates had been arrested in New Mexico. The land stolen through fraud was being returned to its rightful owners where possible, with compensation offered where it was not. "It's really over," Ruby said as Xavier finished reading the letter aloud. "Justice takes time," Xavier replied, "but it comes eventually to those who persist." Ruby took his hand, placing it over her stomach with a smile that held secrets. "Speaking of things that take time," Xavier's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Ruby, are you?" Her nod was barely completed before he gathered her in his arms, joy radiating from him like heat from the desert sun. "When?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "October, the doctor thinks," Ruby replied. "Just in time for our first anniversary." That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Xavier placed his hand protectively over the new life growing within Ruby. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed. "After my parents died, after everything that happened, I thought vengeance was all I had left." Ruby covered his hand with her own. "And now I have everything," Xavier said simply. "A home, a purpose, a family." He leaned down to kiss her, his lips conveying what words could not fully express. "And it all began with you, Ruby Grayson Vance. You and your hiding place and those damned papers that nearly got us both killed." Ruby laughed softly. "When you put it that way, it sounds rather romantic." Xavier grinned. "Isn't it, though? The schoolteacher and the vengeful cowboy finding each other in the midst of conspiracy and danger." "Someone should write that story," Ruby teased. Someone already lived it, Xavier replied, gathering her close. And I wouldn't change a word. Their daughter, Sarah, was born on a crisp October morning, her first cries coinciding with the rising sun. She had Xavier's hazel eyes and Ruby's stubborn chin, a perfect blending of her parents that brought tears to Xavier's eyes when the midwife placed her in his arms. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "You come from brave stock, you know. Your mother is the most courageous woman I've ever known." Ruby watched from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "And your father," she added, "is a man who knows the value of justice and of love." As Sarah grew, so did the pioneer's reputation. By her first birthday, the paper had subscribers throughout the territory, and Ruby and Xavier had established themselves as respected voices in Arizona's growing statehood movement. Luke Vance married a rancher's daughter from south of Prescott, expanding his holdings and providing a gathering place for family celebrations. James chose to remain single, working alongside Xavier and Ruby at the paper, his practical nature balancing Xavier's occasional idealism and Ruby's passionate advocacy. On quiet evenings when the paper was put to bed and Sarah was asleep in her crib, Ruby and Xavier would sometimes sit on their porch and watch the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. In those moments, the dangers they had faced seemed distant, like stories from another life. "Do you ever regret it?" Xavier asked once, his arm around Ruby's shoulders. "Coming west, getting involved in all this." Ruby considered the question, thinking of the comfortable Boston life she might have had if her father hadn't been killed, if she hadn't followed his work to Arizona. "No," she said finally. "Every step of that journey, dangerous as it was, led me here, to this town, this life." She turned to face him, her hand cupping his cheek. "To you and Sarah. How could I regret that?" Xavier captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I thank God every day that you were brave enough to stand your ground that day at the mine, that you didn't reveal your hiding place even when your life depended on it." Ruby smiled at the memory. "And I thank God that a certain stubborn cowboy appeared and said I didn't know anything." "The best lie I ever told," Xavier admitted with a grin. Ruby laughed, leaning into his embrace as the last light of day faded from the sky. Above them, the first stars appeared, the same stars that had guided them through the desert on their desperate journey. Now they shone on a home filled with love, a family forged in adversity but thriving in peace, and a future bright with possibilities neither had dared to dream of before they found each other. And that, Ruby thought as Xavier drew her close for a kiss, was a story worth living and worth telling for generations to come.